From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome to Potomac Watch. I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the editorial pages, and this is our daily opinion page podcast. We are living in an extraordinary moment in American politics as the Democratic Party deliberates privately and often publicly these days about whether to replace President Biden as their nominee after his much-panned debate performance on June 27th. Talk to 100 Democrats these days, and you'll get 100 opinions about what the party should do, when, how, and who should be the nominee. And to make sense of it, our guest today is Ruy Teixeira, a longtime student of democratic politics, now affiliated with the American Enterprise Institute, where he often contributes to a blog called The Liberal Patriot on Substack. He's also author of the book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes. That was out last year. Welcome. All right. Good to hear you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Paul. As you say, this is a rather extraordinary moment in American politics.
Well, let's talk about that now. Democratic Party is having this debate about President Biden's future. The mood seems to shift every day. 2 days ago, Biden was looking to be impregnable. Couldn't force him out yesterday. Wednesday, he was a much worse day for him. Today, everybody's waiting for this press conference related to the NATO summit. Where do you think we are right now?
Well, Paul, I know exactly where we are, and I know exactly what's going to happen. But if I told you, I'd have to kill you. So, that wouldn't be good. Hell, I don't know. I mean, it's a roller coaster, right? Sometimes it looks like he's about to disappear today or tomorrow. Other times it seems like, he's holding on for dear life. They've circled the wagons. There's no way they can get him out of there. But, it does seem we're just an untoward event away from, or sort of a public wall breaking, and certain people coming forward. We're just like inches from him sort of having to get out of there. But I honestly don't know. I really could see him staying through the election. On the other hand, if he resigned tomorrow, I wouldn't be that surprised. You know what I mean? It's just, There's wide variance in the outcomes here. And there's a lot of stuff going on we're just not privy to in terms of conversations behind the scenes.
Yeah, a lot of things going on behind closed doors, people maneuvering, wondering what they can do. I will say this, though. My conversations suggest that while Democrats disagree on the way forward, most of them are pretty pessimistic about the prospects if President Biden does stay. I mean, they're not willing to say he's a certain loser by any stretch. The election still is close, believe it or not. There's a poll out, Washington Post, ABC today has tied President Trump and Joe Biden.
Yeah, though shortly after that, Pew released a poll that had Biden behind by four points.
So, I think it's pretty clear if you look at the aggregate of most surveys, the average, he's behind. Biden is behind. And you see that pessimism reflected in Michael Bennet, the Colorado senator, saying, I think the president's on path to lose. And others, equivocation of Nancy Pelosi saying, well, it's up to the president to make that decision, leaving a pathway open for him. Do you agree with the conventional wisdom that the only way through here, if Democrats do decide that most Democrats that he needs to step aside, would be to have to go through his wife Jill and Hunter and that small group of very, very close advisors?
Well, I certainly think they're sort of his firewall. I do think that, you could get through them, sort of by utilizing public megaphones and so on and so forth and bringing more pressure to bear. And also, again, if something happens that calls his candidacy even further into question, I think Hunter and Jill may be surrounding him with their pistols cocked, but I just don't think it's going to be enough given certain events to prevent him from having to step down. But on the other hand, maybe you fake it till you make it. The longer this goes on, the harder it gets to get rid of him. And behind the scenes, of course, Paul, I mean, everybody agrees, this is a conventional wisdom again, I think it's correct, that if he did step down and opened up the process, one thing that's very probable, certain, is that there'll be enormous chaos. But the person who might emerge from that chaos, which would in and of itself be bad, is probably Kamala Harris, right? And it's just not at all clear she would be any stronger candidate than Biden in this general election. I mean, you can always make the argument that, well, okay, anything's better than what we got. And maybe she would be a little bit better. Maybe she wouldn't. But it's not like it's a slam dunk, right? I mean, it's not like, oh, if we replace Biden with the most probable replacement candidate, we will therefore increase our probability of winning the election from 30 to 65% or even 50%. I don't think people believe that. And that's part of what produces the stasis. The uncertainty that if we did our all to get Biden out of there, we didn't necessarily wind up in a different place. So it's kind of like the deer in the headlights, The car is approaching and nobody's really sure what to do. And the most probable result is that the car will hit you, to carry the metaphor to the breaking point. They're not in a good position. Let's just be honest here.
Yeah, that's pretty clear. It's paradoxical, of course, because Joe Biden picked Kamala Harris as his VP. And when you pick a vice president, presumably you do so because that person would be capable of filling in for you if there was something that happened. And I think one of the implicit arguments that President Biden is making to Democrats when he says, I'm the best candidate to be able to defeat Donald Trump, implicit there is the argument that Kamala Harris would not be as effective as I would be to take Donald Trump on. You get an awful lot of different opinions about that. And of course, the most important fact is just how weak is President Biden against Donald Trump. And the argument by the Democratic partisans of the president, I saw Chris Coons on CNN on Wednesday evening make the case that he's in it. He's not leaving. There's no way, no how. He's in it to win. And he's going to show that to you. He's going to show that with his press conference. He's going to show that with an interview on Monday. He's going to show that with active, vigorous campaigning. The problem with that is that now the media attention is focused on President Biden's performance, and every slip, even ones that you would make if you were 35 years old, would be, as we all do once in a while, will be played up as a dramatic sign of his cognitive decline. So he's got that. He almost has to be flawless if he doesn't want to trigger a cascade of more Democratic defections.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But as people are well aware, even if he is, flawless in this relative context, he's still likely to lose, right? I mean, you look at the aggregate of the polls. I mean, one thing I keep close track of, Paul, is the working class margin for Trump against Biden or against any Democratic candidate. And persistently throughout this cycle, Biden has been losing working class voters as a whole, white and non-white together, by low double digits, right? Which is like about 10 points worse than he did in 2020. In the latest New York Times poll, he's behind by over 20 points among working class voters writ large. In other words, he was in a terrible place with working class voters, and it's just getting worse. And why is that likely to change as he stays in the race and sort of holding on by his fingernails? But equally, one might well ask, okay, let's plug Kamala in there. How likely is it working class voters will warm up to the new improved Democratic candidacy of Kamala Harris? I just think, while it's easy to see that Biden's age is a huge drag in the ticket, it's not the only drag in the ticket. I mean, it's a cumulative result of how voters have processed their lives under the Biden administration and an ongoing weakness Democrats have with working class voters, which I've written about a lot in my Substack. And I think that's just something Democrats, in a sense, haven't even come to grips with.
Right. Well, I just heard a prominent Democrat in a private meeting say that, well, look, the problem is Biden, right? Democratic voters want to make a change, a generational change. You look at every Democratic Senate candidate in the competitive races running ahead of Biden. You look at every race since the Dobbs abortion decision, Democrats have been doing very, very well. So if you make the switch at the top of the ticket, and this person was advocating that, then you will get Kamala or somebody else, and they'll do significantly better. That's their argument. Democrats are not in a bad place as a party, in other words. The president's in a bad place.
Yeah, people love the Democrats as the president. They can't stand. I have some skepticism about that. I mean, yeah, if you look at the midterms where the Democrats did somewhat better than expected and the special elections, I mean, basically we're talking about a party coalition now for the Democrats that is sort of low turnout election specialists, right? The lower the turnout, the more likely they are to do relatively well because they have the most engaged, educated voters who are likely to turn out for, an election for dog catcher, right? So this helps them. But now we're in a presidential election context where massive amounts of peripheral voters surge into the voting pool. And all the data suggests that on net, these voters are much more pro-Trump and much less enthusiastic about the Democrats and Biden than, the sort of more regular committed voters. My friend Henry Olson also points out about the Senate races that, once you take lack of name recognition into account for some of these challengers to Democratic incumbents, it becomes a little bit more questionable how far ahead of they are running against Biden. And he thinks by the time you get to the actual election, it's just hard to run in today's political environment to run that far ahead of the presidential candidate and the results in your given state. So he's skeptical that the gap we now see between Senate Democrats and Biden is going to hold through the election. And I think there's something to that. On the other hand, you could definitely make that argument. If you could replace Biden with a generic Democrat, would that not be better? And, it'd probably be somewhat better, you could argue. But again, I'm just not sure it's the problem-solving beauty that some of these people seem to believe. Oddly enough, I read in your paper today in Karl Rove's column, he said Biden is not only not the best, the only candidate to be able to beat Trump, he's the only candidate who could lose to Trump, which I thought was a rather astonishing statement, but interesting, I have a lot of respect for Rove's political acumen. So clearly that's out there, that Biden is so weak that he is running way behind where any Democrat should be. And that getting rid of him would be a big plus factor, almost no matter who it is. So I think, do we know the truth of this? No, we do not. And people seem to be reluctant to do the experiment. So we'll see, if they're pushed over the edge pretty soon.
Yeah. All right, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about the prospects that Kamala Harris, the vice president, gets the nomination. And could she beat Donald Trump when we come back? Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with my guest, Ruy Teixeira. We're trying to make sense of drama inside the Democratic Party and what the prospects are. There is a good argument, and I subscribe to it, that Trump in the polling has probably maxed out his vote. He never surpassed 50% approval rating across his entire presidency. He's certainly not above 50% now. He's slightly above the President Biden in approval, but this is not Ronald Reagan. There's probably a ceiling for him. And if you've got a substitute candidate, you took the age issue off the table, then parties are quite close. Obviously, it's a polarized country. And the case is for Kamala Harris would be the president endorses her. The party rallies around her. You avoid a contentious 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks as others are competing for the job. And the press will, I think, rally around her. Most of the press coverage, because they hate Trump so much, will start to find hidden reserves of talent and experience in the vice president.
They're already doing it.
Right. It all would depend, obviously, on how she performed. But there'll be a lot of commentary. I've already read that, this is not the same Kamala Harris of 2019 when she washed out of the debates, couldn't defend her own Medicare plan.
And couldn't even mobilize black voters.
Right. This is the new and improved vice president, and she's ready and raring to go and can take Trump on. Now, that's the argument for Harris. But I want to ask you, why do you think she would be the odds-on favorite? I've seen a lot of Democrats say, let's have an open convention. My own view is that that would be vastly preferable, even potentially for Harris, because if Harris has to compete with the 3 or 4 or 5 others for the job, and she gets it, she'll at least have run that test, and that'll put her in a stronger position. What do you think of that?
Well, I'm sympathetic to that idea. I do think it might be better for the party and arguably better for her if that was the process. I still think she'd have, as it were, the plurality of probability. You had to pick a single candidate out of the basket, even under that scenario, who would be the nominee. I think it'd still be her because she is the vice president. And I just think Democrats are going to have a really hard time, dealing with she's a vice president. She's a black woman. What the hell are you doing trying to put somebody else in her place? This just shows, how we haven't, really reckoned with our underlying racism or blah, 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 whatever. The arguments write themselves. So I think that would be a big point in her favor. And I do think she would get, as you're pointing out, sort of the media megaphone would start pointing positively in her direction. And I think that would help her as well. I'm a little more skeptical about how this would land with actual voters who do determine the outcome. I mean, I think those of us in the Washington bubble, we really overestimate how much the discourse has an effect on ordinary voters, normal voters, particularly working class voters. I mean, people in Washington and people in the press, people in the legacy media, they may be, shouting hosannas to Kamala Harris. But I think out there in the flyover country and ordinary working class communities, it's kind of like they don't listen to that stuff. That's not how they think about the world, and that's not how they process things. So even if, you did see this shift from Biden being scrutinized so heavily for any gaffe he might make to, in a sense, trying to pump up Kamala Harris, I just wonder where it really counts, how much difference that would truly make, given the underlying nature of politics today, given what's happened in working class communities, given the views of these voters on things like the economy and immigration and crime and all the other obvious weaknesses of the Democratic ticket. And the fact, let's not forget this, Paul, Trump's running a very smart campaign. This is a new improved Trump campaign. And I think they're doing a lot of things right.
What makes you think this is a new and improved DJT?
Well, I think that he is being more disciplined. I think that his campaign team is actually orient him toward moving in an, sort of a modest way toward the center on some issues like abortion, where he said, I'm going to leave it to the states. He's disavowed Project 2025 in no uncertain terms. And I think he's being very careful. He's Trump and he's going to say some crazy things, but he really is trying to sand off some of the rough edges. And they really are trying to keep him more disciplined and focused on where he can actually pick up voters and speaking to that. I mean, you could even see that in the debate with Biden. Now, admittedly, the format was very good for him because he couldn't speak at that great length. But he did, hit his talking points over and over again. And yeah, I mean, he made up a lot of data. I mean, my rule with Trump is, whatever number he uses, divided by 10, and you might get sort of close to the actual number.
Yeah, I thought kind of most egregious example of that, where it's saying that every legal scholar wanted Roe v. Wade to be overturned.
Right. I'd say that's a bit of an overclaim. Yeah. So, but people like that kind of rogue bluster in a way. I think a lot of the voters to whom he appeals, and to some extent now we're used to it. They're used to it. I mean, it may outrage people like us who actually pay attention to the data. and it rubs us the wrong way when people say absurd, highly exaggerated things. But I think, it's part of who he is now. And I think for a lot of voters, it's, that's Trump. I still kind of like the guy, and I really, friggin' hate the Democrats and Biden. I think the country's a mess.
I remember the pre-COVID Trump years fondly. Real incomes are rising. And
Democrats hate to admit that, but it's just a fact.
It's just a fact. Even the data today coming out on last month's inflation data showed that over the last 12 months, real average earnings have only gone up 0.8% in the last 12 months.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think they were hoping for more than that. I know they were hoping for more.
Yeah, for 12 months. And that was with essentially no inflation in the month. Mm-hmm. And if you look across the previous 2 years of Biden, then real earnings have in fact fallen over the course of the Biden presidency. So Harris, if she does get it, she has to defend the Biden economic record because she's been right there all the time. And then she has to defend the immigration policies, which she was allegedly in charge of. Good word, allegedly, because I don't think anybody was in charge of it. So she has to defend that. And that is, as you say, a very big problem that Donald Trump could attack. On the other hand, she will prosecute the abortion issue much more effectively than Joe Biden did in that first debate, for sure. Now, Donald Trump is attempting to neutralize that, and maybe he has with his leave it to the states argument.
Well, I think he's partially, he's minimized the damage, right? I mean, it's still a good issue for the Democrats. They will run on it and it will help them, but not as much as if Trump was sort of temporizing about a national abortion ban.
So I guess the other fear of the Democrats in going to somebody other than Harris is just the chaotic situation that you'd have. But my view would be, look, you'd have the world's attention on the convention. You'd have the average voter say, oh, maybe I should pay attention to this. and you'd have a lot more information about who the candidates are. Could be that maybe whoever gets the nomination comes out with a surge of energy and focus.
Absolutely. I think the people of the United States would rise up in joy for nominee Gavin Newsom. I mean, that would just be tremendous, right?
Well, I'm not thinking Gavin Newsom. He carries a lot of California baggage on his shoulders.
Right. No, but you know what I mean. You just don't know what you're going to get. If we could wave a magic wand and say, okay, Gretchen Whitmer, you are the nominee, or okay, Josh Shapiro, you are the nominee, that would be great. I'd do that in a second, but, that may not be how it goes down.
All right, we're going to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about particular class of voters within parties of the left, so-called Brahmin left, when we come back. Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast. That is, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with our Potomac Watch podcast, and here with my guest, Ruy Teixeira, follower of all things Democratic and author of the book, Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes. All right. I want to talk to you about your latest Substack piece, which is a last hurrah for the Brahmin left. It's crunch time for a fading political model. Now, you cite the UK elections, the French elections, and talking about developments in the Democratic Party in the U.S. What do you mean by the Brahmin left, and why would it be their last hurrah?
Right. Okay, well, the Brahmin left is a term coined by Thomas Piketty and his colleagues based on their study of many, many decades of electoral data and demographic data. The basic idea is that if you look objectively about how left parties have evolved, they become increasingly dependent and dominated by more educated voters, professional voters, people in that part of the socioeconomic spectrum, and they've been steadily losing support among working class and less educated voters. That's just a fact. It's true across countries. And given that, it shouldn't be a tremendous surprise that these left parties of today, these Brahmin left parties, tend to favor issues and be preoccupied by cultural issues and taking cultural stands and being all in on the so-called Green Revolution in a way that is just not, working class voters aren't too happy about. They don't feel it's in their wheelhouse. They don't feel it's in their interest. But these issues are of tremendous concern to the people who now increasingly dominate these parties. So basically, I was taking a look at the French, UK, and US elections to tell us where that's going, because after a certain point, it's just a mathematical fact that given the relative weight of the working class and the educated voters in these Western societies, you can certainly make up for certain amount of losses among working class voters by jacking up your support among, the educated and professional classes. But at some point, that model starts to break down if the losses among the working class are too large. It's just not plausible. You can take 100% of the educated vote. So I was asking the question, do we see signs of that now? And I looked at the French election, where you see that the only way that Marine Le Pen and the National Rally were kept from a massive second-round victory was because of the deals that were made between the Brahmin left, which was represented by the New Popular Front, which includes the Greens, the Socialists, the Communists, and Mélenchon's La France Insoumise, LFI, which is very, very left and very, very Brahmin. And I deduced some of the demographic data that shows that that's the case. So even though Marine Le Pen and the National Rally and allies did not do as well as they had hoped, they nevertheless made huge gains over the previous election. And now you have this completely dysfunctional political marriage, forced marriage, shotgun marriage between Macron's centrist coalition and the New Popular Front. And I think it's a reasonable expectation. They won't be able to get much done. They certainly won't solve a lot of the problems the working class are concerned about. And, now National Rally's in opposition, and they can continue to grow their strength. So it was sort of a win for the Brahmin left, they pulled it out of the rear end, but I don't think that model works going forward, or at any rate is really called into question. I looked at the Labour Party too in Britain, and we can see that they actually they did pretty well in terms of moving away from what had been their Brahmin left trajectory. Morgan McSweeney, I think, is very influential there in terms of how he's modified their electoral strategy and image, trying to move to the center somewhat on cultural issues, sort of dialing back the Green Prosperity Plan a little bit, emphasizing patriotism. I think all that was helpful, and Keir Starmer was a vessel into which he poured those ideas. Now the dog has caught the bus. They've got, 412 seats out of 650, thanks to the weird multi-party first-past-the-post system they have, which can translate 35% of the vote into 63% of the seats. But now they actually had to do stuff. And, Britain's in very bad shape economically, and the party is still committed to fairly aggressive clean energy transition plans. I'd say that basically cultural radicalism of one sort or another still hegemonizes huge parts of the party. And if you look at the actual commitments of the Labour Party, they're still down with a lot of that stuff, and there'll be an enormous pressure to deliver on it. So I don't know how long this is going to last. This what could potentially be a new model, more working class support, less support among the professional classes, and sort of benefiting from that. Because if you look at where the working class votes went in this election, some of them went from the Conservatives, who lost a ton, to Labour, but most of them went to Nigel Farage's Reform Party.
Right.
The bulk of these defections. So clearly they're waiting in the wings. And I think that depending on how they govern, this could be a complete disaster, or maybe it could be the beginning of a new model. I don't know. And that's sort of where I landed on that, though, again, I'm a bit skeptical. And then if you look at the U.S., I was rehearsing some of those data earlier about how incredibly much the Democrats have lost in terms of working class support, right? And given the distribution of voters overall and in most states, especially important states, this is really bad for them. I mean, at some point that model was going to break, right? You can't keep on losing working class support indefinitely and make up for it among the college educated. We may have reached that breaking point, where Democrats, again, in the Times poll of likely voters, 23 points down among the working class, 18 points up among the college educated. That doesn't work. And it does look like across polls, and it's been consistent this cycle, Democrats are probably going to land about 10 or 12 points worse, at least, among working class voters than they did in 2020. So I think the Brahmin left model in the U.S., at least, is breaking. It could be their last hurrah. But we shall see. Maybe, Gretchen Whitmer will grab the nomination and everything will be copacetic. But
I sense a skepticism on your part.
I have a bit of skepticism there.
It sounds like you think that it's either Biden or Harris, and both of them would be underdogs. Am I right in saying?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly what's going to happen. That's why we hold the elections. But boy, it ain't looking so good for Team Blue.
All right. Let's leave it there. I want to thank my guest, Ruy Teixeira, author of Where Have All the Democrats Gone? The Soul of the Party in the Age of Extremes, and also contributor to one of my favorite Substacks, The Liberal Patriot, where I learn about the center-left Democrats without the lunatics. So,
well put.
So thanks for joining us, Ruy. Appreciate it. And thanks, everybody, for listening. We're here every day on Potomac Watch, and we'll watch the political drama unfold. Thanks for listening.